Welcome everyone to Miller Johnson's webinar series, a series designed to keep our clients informed and up to date on important issues and events critical to businesses, your employees, and our communities. It's been more than 10 years since thousands of protesters were outside the Capitol building in Lansing, and there was the passage of right to work. Some of us remember that vividly. Some of us who started in labor law many years ago didn't think Michigan, a very historically supportive state of organized labor, would ever see that happen, but it did. And we're currently one of 27 states with right to work laws. However, last year's election, following that, the Democrat Party now controls the Michigan House, Senate, and the governorship, something that hasn't happened in nearly 40 years. And we have seen in the first quarter here bills introduced to repeal Michigan's right to work law, and that could happen within the next few months. But rather than give you Miller Johnson attorneys' thoughts on this issue, we're fortunate to have been able to assemble an outstanding panel of thought leaders in the space. We have Andy Johnston. Andy is the Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Strategic Engagement at the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce. Andy is responsible for managing the Chamber's public policy efforts on behalf of more than 2,800 members who are interested in creating a vibrant business economy and environment that benefits everyone. Of course, right to work is one of the public policies that Andy has been tracking and draws his attention. You may have seen him recently quoted in a number of the articles written on this topic. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you.
Second, we have Erin Dornbos. Erin is an attorney with Pinsky, Smith, Fayette, and Kennedy, based here in Grand Rapids. Erin is an excellent attorney who spends her professional time representing workers and large labor organizations throughout Michigan. We often see Erin on the other side of matters that we represent for our clients, and we can tell you firsthand that she brings creativity, thoughtfulness, and tenacity in representing her clients. We're excited that Erin has agreed to join us to share some views and important thoughts from the worker and union perspective on right to work.
Thank you for inviting me.
Welcome, Erin. Next, we have Michael LaFaive. Mike is the Senior Director of the Morey Fiscal Policy Initiative at the Mackinac Center for Public Policy based in Midland, Michigan. Mike has authored or co-authored hundreds of essays or commentaries on fiscal policy involving state and local matters. As it relates to today's issue, Mike has co-authored 3 studies on the economic impacts of right to work, 2 for the Mackinac Center and 1 for an academic peer-reviewed journal. It's great to have you with us, and welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, and maybe not most importantly, but we have my friend and partner, Nate Plantinga. Nate has represented employers on traditional labor matters for more than 25 years. He has a vast experience and knowledge on all things traditional labor, and we're glad that he's joined us today. Say hello, Nate.
Hello, Nate.
So before we jump into some of the history here and what the impacts that some of you have seen on right to work in the last 10 years, I think it's important for our listeners that we set the stage on what right to work really is, kind of the nuts and bolts. And Nate, would you mind just kind of giving us a thumbnail sketch about what are we talking about when we say right to work law?
Yeah, sure. And I think there is a fair amount of confusion out there. I have a lot of clients who think right to work is synonymous with at-will employment. Of course, it isn't. But in order to understand what right to work is, you have to understand what a union security clause is. And a union security clause is a very common clause in a collective bargaining agreement between a unionized employer and a union representing some portion of the employees. And a union security clause essentially says that employees who are represented by the union have to become and remain members of the union at least to the extent of paying dues or paying a representative portion of dues. And that clause in a collective bargaining agreement is enforceable to the extent that an employee who doesn't comply can be, by virtue of the contract, terminated. They can lose their employment. And so a union security clause is one that, for obvious reasons, unions are interested in, and typically does make its way into a collective bargaining agreement where it is legal. In a right to work state, that clause is not legal. And so right to work states prohibit union security clauses. And that means in Michigan, 10 years ago, which I can't quite believe, probably 95%, that's anecdotal, but I think it's probably pretty close. The collective bargaining agreements in Michigan had union security clauses, and overnight those clauses became unlawful. Now, there was a runway at the time, but that dramatically changed every collective bargaining agreement between Michigan employers and unions representing their employees.
Great. And does the right to work law have any direct impact on employee or worker organization rights? And if they wanted to form a union, does it have any impact on that?
It doesn't have any legal impact on employees' rights to form a union. I think it may have some practical impact in the sense that the difference between an employee who understands that he or she is going to have to pay dues, whether or not they voted for the union, or whether or not they think that the union is delivering value, is a relevant consideration in terms of their desire to form a union.
Great. Erin, do you want to jump in here and share the perspective, from the union lawyer side?
Sure. Well, one thing I would point out is that also right to work has nothing to do with the union's obligation or duty to fairly represent its members. So when you are a member of a bargaining unit, and often I find confusion with this, even within union and employer contexts, the difference between being a member of a bargaining unit, which means you have a job within the classification covered by the contract. So the union is your exclusive representative. That's different than what is now being a dues paying member, where you elect now under the right to work you have to elect to pay dues to the union to be a member. The union's obligation, however, is the same across the board. They have the same duty to negotiate on behalf of all of those members, the same duty to represent them in grievance proceedings and disciplinary termination proceedings across the board. And that is by law a legal duty of fair representation. So that issue, and you'll hear the term freeloading quite a bit from my side of the aisle, with this, and that now bargaining unit members can opt out of paying towards the cost of covering those rights, and yet they're entitled to the exact same rights as dues paying members.
Thank you for that. I think that sets the stage on what right to work is and what it isn't. I'd like to shift to maybe some of our panelists can comment on what we've seen, in the last 10 years, right? Part of the pitch for right to work passage was this will be beneficial. It'll help us grow economically. It may attract businesses to source work in Michigan rather than maybe Ohio or other Midwest states. So why don't we start with Andy? Can you comment on what you've seen or what you've discovered in the last 10 years? Observation.
Yeah, I mean, and it has been a decade. Wow, I now have senior in my title. Time flies. But Keith, just to back up, the Grand Rapids Chamber launched the West Michigan Policy Forum in 2008, and we came out with right to work as one of our top priorities then. And frankly, as you said in your intro, we got laughed at by Southeast Michigan that Michigan would ever become a right to work state. And then that, the Overton window of policy and political opportunity opened up in 2012 for a variety of reasons. And Michigan was able to become a right to work state. And I have vivid memories of being right across the street over here, wading through the protesters to go talk to lawmakers about why this was important. And since 2012 in Michigan, I think we have a great track record to talk about. In the 9 years, our labor force is up, wages are up, benefits are up, state budget is up. We are seeing more economic development projects consider Michigan. I mean, there's a variety of factors, but right to work is on every economic development and site selectors list when they're thinking about states of where to come to. So I think it's safe to say that this has been definitely a positive, but definitely not a negative. Hard to point out. The only negative I see is that private sector unionization has gone down slightly.
Great. Mike, you want to jump in here? I know you've authored some studies or co-authored some studies, and one of them concluded that right to work states that adopt such laws typically improves economic growth and development. Would you like to jump in?
I'd love to. I too was in Lansing on that important day, the historic day. And literally the same week, I thought, well, sometime in the future, I would love to be the first to be able to measure the impact that this right to work law had on Michigan, either positive or negative. And it was just really a matter at that point of waiting for the statistics to be developed over enough years that would provide us an opportunity to do such an analysis. And last May or so, we released a very large study that looked at the impact of right to work laws across the country at the county level. So our data set had information on 3,000 counties. And the reason we chose this particular methodology is we thought that the impact of right to work laws might show up on border counties first. And in industries, we looked at 18 of them that were the most union dense, such as manufacturing, construction, utilities, information, that sort of thing. And so we had a limited set of data when it came to Michigan for just 6 years, because we looked at adoptions in the adoption of Michigan for 2012, and we found a mostly positive impact in employment share at the border county level, and then also in internal counties as well. Nationwide, we found that those states that adopted right to work laws after 2000 saw a 21% increase in the share of manufacturing employment in border counties. And of course, the reason we look at those border counties is we wanted to look at states that had right to work protections for their counties, whereas just over the border, they did not. It gave us an opportunity to control for a lot of variables that would have otherwise affected the output, like days of sunshine, attitudes towards unions, et cetera. Then we zeroed in on Midwest states. So those that touched each other, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and we found a 26% bump in the share of manufacturing employment for Michigan, 27% for Indiana, which we thought was very interesting because it was so close to our percentage and right next door. And then we were delighted to learn that a couple of Harvard scholars used a similar technique that we had used and came up with a figure of a 28% gain in the manufacturing share of employment for right to work states in border counties. So it made us feel more confident that our measures were correct. We also found improvements in the construction area, utilities, and information, but it also depended on what years we were looking at, before 2000 or after 2000.
How do you answer the question of, that's all sounds good, and that's some good positive statistics maybe, but the causation correlation issue, right? I mean, how strongly do we feel that it's really right to work that is helping this economic growth? I mean, I get it. It might be a factor that I look at if I'm an outside business looking to build a new factory in Michigan, but how do you answer the causation correlation?
Been doing that for years. You can cite a lot of narrative statistics, and the Mackinac Center has done so itself. It's just that we identify them as narrative statistics and say, look, this is a trend line. It's for Michigan and other right to work states. There are other variables at play, but that's exactly why we go so far out of our way to control for other variables that might influence, say, growth in manufacturing employment. For years, the knock on the performance of right to work states was that, right to work states are mostly located in the South, and they have more days of sunshine, more temperate weather, different attitudes towards unions, et cetera. But economists have looked at this enough where they know what to control for in order to best isolate the impact that right to work has, not just on manufacturing employment, but on population changes, on productivity growth, et cetera. So there's a lot of skilled people looking at these questions, and on balance, it favors adoption of right to work laws.
And I stand on the shoulders of those really smart people and, talk about what they've studied. But from an economic development perspective, the way I've described it and the chamber feels about it is, right to work is no silver bullet, right? There's so many other variables that go into creating a vibrant business climate. Right to work is such an important tool for a state to have, or an arrow in the quiver of creating an environment that's going to support economic success. So that's why, we supported it, making the change. Looking back in my archives, there's a lot from 2012, Michigan's making the statement that we're open for business. And that's partly why we're so concerned about potential repeal, is that a sweeping change like that could send the wrong message.
Great.
Well, I will add that I think it's particularly important for Michigan because at least this time of year, I'm not sure we have days of sunshine, plural.
Minutes. We have minutes of sunshine.
One day.
And I'd be happy to circle back to studies on that too.
Oh my goodness. All right, we're going to let Erin weigh in here, right? Because I've read enough, and I've seen that there's studies that suggest that right to work actually reduces the average pay for workers and may have a negative impact. So, Erin, I'm sure you are much more familiar with that side of things. So I just give you the opportunity to maybe comment on what you've heard, or maybe talk about the negative impacts that might be associated with right to work.
Sure. Well, there are plenty of statistics and studies out there directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that show the positive impact of unionization on wages. And so when we're talking about economic realities and business and the measures of economic success in a state, you have to look at the people. They are our economy, the workers, the middle-class workers that make up our labor unions. And we know that non-union versus union, 83% of the wages of a unionized worker. We know that unionization reduces pay gaps in terms of gender equity and racial equity. We know that unionization increases access to retirement plans, to healthcare benefits, to union workers are more likely to receive paid leave. And the NLRB and OSHA have done studies that union plans, they are more likely to discover early and address safety concerns. So in all of this context, we know that promoting unionization helps raise workers' wages, improve the quality of their lives, which impacts all of us. When you look at then the relation of right to work to those benefits, where you are directly taking away the union's capacity, their resources to bring about those benefits. And we've seen, as you said, Keith, we've seen the decrease in unionization in Michigan since right to work has come into place. Now, there were trend lines, as we talked about, there have been trend lines about lower unionization rates anyway, but those have increased since the right to work has been in place. So when you have lessening, weakening, I mean, no one disputes that this has chipped away at the union's ability financially and politically to do what it needs to do to represent its workers, which has serious economic impact on the state. And I think you can also look at things. You can look at like the Intel plant in Columbus, Ohio. January 22, Ohio is a non-right to work state, and Intel has announced it's investing $100 billion in opening a plant in Ohio. So you have examples like that where it's not as if, I mean, that was the fear, right? When Indiana became a right to work state, that was one of the real prompters in Michigan to say, we got to do it too, or all of our work is going to go to Indiana. Ohio is not right to work, and that has not happened in Ohio. So I do think there are multiple factors that go into it, not just the days or lack thereof of sunshine. I also think, in reviewing Michael's study before this is from 2018, at least the most recent, the one that was published in April. I haven't seen any statistics, and I don't think it would be possible to see economic statistics post-pandemic. And we know that post-pandemic, in the most recent Gallup poll, American support for unions is up. It's the highest it's been since 1965. 71% of Americans support unions. And we've all seen and experienced the disruption in the labor market and the economy since the pandemic. I don't think we can extrapolate out a lot from 2018 to present. We're facing a different labor market, one in which employers need to attract workers. And the way they can do that, according to 71% that support labor unions, would be also to support labor unions.
Great. I'm going to bookmark a question to come back to you, Erin, but because you mentioned Mike's study, I want to at least give him the opportunity if he wanted to respond.
Right. Our impact analysis stops at 2018. It was a 2018 measurement. So we haven't been able to measure what's happened since the pandemic in a scholarly way. But we do know from the narrative statistics that right to work states on net balance have more than recovered all the jobs lost in the pandemic, while forced unionization states are still behind the curve. They've seen a decline, actually. Unfortunately, Michigan is not one of those top performers. They're more of a drag on the net balance of right to work states. But again, as Andy said, lots of variables go into the growth equation. I'd also like to point out that companies do locate in right to work states or non-right to work states like Ohio, but Intel got a huge cash subsidy bribe to do so. Part of that was perhaps because of the extra costs associated with high tax rates or whatever else is considered a burden to locate in Ohio.
Yeah, so maybe to Andy's point about there's no silver bullet about what attracts businesses.
Right, and I recognize that as well. One more thing, if I could, our study didn't address wages. I think wages are the area where the literature is perhaps the most mixed if you pick wages in a particular year. But on wage growth, I think the preponderance of evidence shows that wage growth is faster in right to work states.
I noticed in the Detroit News article in early January that it had suggested that the average weekly wage rate at the end of 2012 was $9.54, and that it was at $12.90 at the end of 2021 for Michigan. Adjusted for inflation was $10.62, which by my lawyer math, that's about an 11% increase. So that was reported. It looks like a Georgia State University and a Trinity University study quoted in the Detroit News article, Right to Work a Decade Later. So,
and Keith, in that same article too, it highlights that Ohio's average weekly rate when adjusted for inflation grew 13% compared to Michigan's at 11%. So I think that's also, again, it's not always a direct and clear line to draw.
No, agreed. And I think that was Mike's point too, right? That the wages is where you see the difference in the data and the studies. So, Erin, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question about, you had made a statement that, it's going to hurt the revenue. It's going to see a decrease. UAW official, I can't remember the specific individual's name, but suggested that the UAW really didn't see an impact, right? In other words, the UAW membership said, look, we value our union. We're right to work. You guys are getting us better wages and benefits, so we're going to pay our dues. We're really not going to see, they didn't really see a decrease, I don't think. Is that true of lots of unions, or what are you seeing? Is it really a drop in revenue stream for the unions?
Sure. Well, I'll start by saying I'm not surprised you hear that from the UAW for a few reasons. One, it's probably accurate, but also they're not out there promoting the loss of revenue because that's not something that you want to publicly share. It undercuts their ability to do their job if they're out there saying we've lost this amount of money, we've lost this. So you're not going to hear unions talking about that. They are strong. They're increasingly strong. But the reality is, I liken it to paying my taxes. I pay my taxes and I'm quite happy that I have schools and roads and access to public safety because of those taxes. If someone came and say I could lawfully decide not to pay those and still get all of those benefits, would I be really tempted to do that? Absolutely. And that doesn't mean that I don't value it or don't think I should, but I'm still tempted. It's human. And I think that you're absolutely necessarily going to lose membership. And I know in the groups that I work with, they've done an excellent job. These are people that put their heart and souls into the work and believe strongly in labor and in organization. And they convey that message to their members, and they've done so successfully. but it's not 100%, and it used to be. So absolutely, you've lost revenue, and you've added that layer of complication, administrative complication for both the employer and the union. You've also added a layer of divisiveness that I've seen cause real issues day to day from both the union and the employer side when you suddenly have a member v. non-member dynamic. So there have been real consequences, both financially and practically, with the way the unions do their job. Now, that being said, again, the groups I work with are phenomenal about communicating their value, and they manage to continue to do that. But I'd say, despite, certainly not because of, and it doesn't mean that they have not been and continue to be negatively impacted by right to work.
Nate, would you mind sharing a perspective from the employer side as a traditional labor lawyer, what you've seen anecdotally or otherwise?
Yeah, and I want to be clear that I can only probably speak anecdotally. I don't know that I've seen studies on this, but I think that there's a significant component to right to work rights that maybe we haven't addressed here, which is employees' understanding of their rights and then their ability to execute on their rights. And so I think there are a number of people. I mean, I have all kinds of clients. It's happened so many times. The first time it happened, I thought it was hilarious. And now I just sort of take it for granted to say, we've got employees who don't even know they're in a union. And so, you know, it's the idea that an employee fully understands what right to work is, what it means for him or her, and what they can do about it, I think is, it's, I don't know what proportion of employees understand that, but it's certainly less than 100%. And then even if somebody understands, if they have signed a checkoff authorization, which is a document that's typically provided by the union that represents the employees, that is typically tied to a different provision in a collective bargaining agreement that provides for the payment of dues via employer payroll deduction. Those checkoff authorizations often come with language that makes them irrevocable for some period of time. And so, you know, somebody may have the right to stop paying dues, but they don't have the right to do it right now. In fact, they have the right to do it only whenever that authorization provides. And those authorizations can be a little difficult for employees to unravel.
Well, let's shift gears a little, unless if anyone has another comment, I'll leave it open for another comment on kind of the impact in the last 10 years.
There's a couple academic studies I just want to mention briefly. One is found in the Journal of Law and Economics. It's a 2019 piece by Christos Makridis, and he used Gallup data to ascertain the sentiments of unionized workers and non-unionized workers before and after adoption of a right to work law. And he actually found that there was greater satisfaction, greater positive sentiment amongst union workers after adoption of a right to work law than in non-right to work states. So that's a journal article worthy of your time.
I appreciate where Erin's coming from. And, you know, not all unions are created equal. The folks that aren't her clients, you know, may not be great unions to be a member of, right? And I also want to be clear, the Grand Rapids Chamber is not anti-union. It's more of, let's create, you know, opportunity for choice and creative incentives for unions, you know, to convey their value to members, right? And why people should be a part of it. Because, you know, and having that incentive through right to work, I think is positive. Unions still have a role to play. And then just going forward, obviously, since the other court decisions with Janus, if we were to change right to work, we'd only be impacting private sector, which I think is very much a concern for the Grand Rapids Chamber going forward, that if we did repeal right to work through these bills, I'm helping you with your segue, Keith, through these bills that now, you know, will be coming before the legislature, we'd only be impacting the private sector. And we'd, again, create an imbalance between private sector employees and public sector employees.
Right. And for our listeners, the Janus decision is the Supreme Court decision that would not be changed. So the Michigan legislature cannot undo the Janus decision. So that's why the public sector would be treated differently. Very good point. Actually, but you caused me to want to talk about another point before I say. And I'm going to throw this out to Nate because it's something that we've talked about here as Miller Johnson labor lawyers, right? From an organizing perspective, right? The chamber is about a great economy for everyone and choice. And when an organizing drive occurs, when employees decide, hey, we think this is a good idea, we want to exercise our legal rights. I think in our experience, and maybe Nate, you can comment on this, it might be something positive for union organizers that it's a right to work state.
Yeah, and my guess is that Erin may not fully agree with this, or even partially agree with this. But I mean, what we have seen, and we've seen it both on employees who are forming a new union and in situations where employees may be looking to decertify their union, which is the same process in reverse. Employees who are already unionized deciding whether they want to stay union, that it can actually operate against a union's interest to have a right to work environment, because employees don't care as much, or at least employees that are opposed to being union don't have the same level of investment because they're not going to be required to pay dues. And so if an employee says, well, I don't want the union, and there's a decertification drive going, and they're worried that they're going to have to continue to pay $40 or $50 or $60 a month, whatever it is, their interest in advocating for a decertification result, talking to coworkers about a decertification result, making sure that they vote, pulling other people in to vote, that's that interest, that investment, that enthusiasm is higher than if they say, well, I'll let my coworkers decide. I'm good. I mean, that's the syndrome that Erin was talking about, where somebody says, well, I'm still going to get the benefits of representation to the extent that I think that they exist, but I'm not paying. So I'm really not all that invested in this anyway. So I think that when an employer is looking to communicate with employees, they're going to communicate. You should at least figure out here what the consequences of this decision are going to be, and evaluate them and make sure that you're making the best decision for you and for your family. And the difference between saying that one consequence is that you will pay dues, whether you want the union or not, whether you think you're getting value or not, whether you're satisfied with the contract or not, you're going to pay dues. The difference between that message and you can pay or not pay, it's up to you, is a pretty significant difference.
Right. So essentially you're saying is, if there's a decertification effort, why do I need to get involved in that? I just don't pay the dues. And I was thinking on the front end, right? I've always thought if I were in the shoes of a union organizer, I could go to the employees and say, give us a shot, right? Give us a chance to prove our worth and our value. And because it's a right to work state, if we don't deliver on that, yeah, we're going to want you to pay dues, but there's nothing that requires it. So great. Erin, I'll let you have a shot at that if you'd like. Otherwise, we'll move on to the bills.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think actually Nate hit on the issue that I would have, but from the flip perspective. I mean, the whole point of a collective bargaining unit is to operate as a collective. I mean, it's a brotherhood, a sisterhood. You hear that. You hear union officials and members using that terminology for a reason. It's meant to be a collective together. It's not meant to be I don't care because I'm not going to have to pay for it. We want people invested both in the choice they're making for their representative, and then also the fact that that's going to impact what they pay in dues and what they reap in benefits. We want them invested in that, and labor unions want that participation based on that. And I think right to work has really let it be a let's see, maybe, I don't care, it's not coming out of my check. It's really undermined the ability for it to operate collectively, both in a cert or decert situation. And I do think the unions have really strong efforts towards organizing in terms of making that, explaining who they are. One thing I wanted to point out is that, I hear this and I read this, they can stop paying their dues and let the union know they're not satisfied with the representation, they're not getting what they want. Well, dues paying members, and it used to be all members, they vote for their leaders. They vote to ratify a contract or not ratify a contract. That is where their power is. Their power in a collective is not to say, I'm not going to participate, I'm not going to care. They get to vote, and by everyone shouldering the load the same way we all do to support our taxes and our parks, that lets then the union work as a collective. And if they want to desert based on that, but do it as a collective, not as I don't care.
So, Andy, I'm going to turn to you because it seems like the Michigan legislature is throwing wrenches in your schedule. So my guess is you're tracking these bills, right? There's a House bill and a Senate bill. What are you hearing, seeing? What is the chamber? Is this going to come down soon? Is the governor going to sign it? Are we going to get a compromise? Look into your crystal ball for us, please.
Yeah, the Lansing crystal ball is usually a little murky and changes by the day. And, somebody once said, some people push paper, other people push rumors. A lot of rumors pushed around Lansing, but it's no secret. With the Democrats taking charge of the legislature, all the levers of government, this is top on their list to get accomplished this year. I think it's a question of when. We've heard as early as March. We've heard later in the legislative session to try and get other things done. The Republicans and the Democrats have kind of tried to work together a little bit in this legislative session. I might be a little, generous with kind of sort of working together a little bit. The lever that or the leverage that the Republicans have is under current rules, giving bills immediate effect, right? In the state Senate. Because the Democrats have such slim majorities, 1-vote majorities in the House and in the Senate. There was a bill recently to move the presidential primary up in the state of Michigan. The Republicans withheld the immediate effect vote. So what does that do? That means that we can't legally move up that presidential date until after the session ends. So what may happen is the Democrats may, it's being called a nuclear option. I don't pronounce that correctly, but you get my drift.
That is a hard word to pronounce.
Thank you, Nate. And they might end the legislative session early to put that bill into effect, and then call special legislative sessions after that. Now, given how nicely the Republicans and Democrats are not playing together with the current tax discussions, what would happen is they could just pass right to work and do all these special legislative sessions, and Republicans giving immediate effect to bills. The big one being economic development projects won't matter as much to the Democrats. And so you could see right to work come up a lot earlier in the legislative session. And I'll stop there. And I hope that Schoolhouse Rock summary makes sense to our listeners. But this is really about legislative rules, when bills go into effect, and needing Republican votes under current Senate rules to make laws that are passed and signed by the governor go into effect quickly rather than 90 days after a legislative session.
I'm just a bill sitting here on Capitol Hill.
Yeah,
that's
to our
right.
Listeners over the age of 40, that made all the sense in the world.
Anyone else, or are you hearing, seeing anything? One of the things that I've heard is rumors, right? As Andy said, is that the right to work and reinstating Michigan prevailing wage across the state are kind of hand in glove. Is anyone hearing anything like that?
I would just say absolutely. And another bill that keeps me up at night, that should also keep labor attorneys up at night, is the local preemption bills that were passed in 2018, preventing a patchwork of HR related laws. And, you could see Ann Arbor passing different laws, Detroit, Saginaw. That's currently not allowed. That's one that's on I have a big worry list of things that have been accomplished over the last decade and a half that could potentially be undone. But prevailing wage is definitely in the discussion as well. again, the Democrats, taking power in November, it was no secret, the list of priorities. They put them on Twitter. They talked about them in the news of the things they want to get done, and right to work and prevailing wage are right there. Part of this is political. Erin was talking about, right to work impacting the political power of unions and the ability to get donations that they then turn over to 95% one political party. And so that's also a factor that's in play here in Lansing.
Andy, that list of labor priorities actually predates, the election. It goes back to, I think, January, February of 2022, where the Democrats Labor Caucus said, if elected, these would be our priorities. And I think they started with removing the prohibition or the prevented contracting out as a subject of collective bargaining.
I've even heard, right, that there's a potential to put a bill enact or enroll a bill that would make every employee subject private sector just cause employment. What we typically see in a union collective bargaining agreement, right? That's a large selling point often for unions is, hey, you get job protection through just cause provisions in the contract. And I've seen that as well. So yeah, very interesting stuff. I want to ask a question. Is anyone familiar with or any studies on what does the electorate think of the right to work appeal, right? We all have our interests. We all represent clients or groups and have our thoughts and our philosophies, but anyone familiar or have input on what the general public is thinking?
Yes, before and after adoption of a right to work law, polls have been done about the right to work law. I can recall back as far as 2006 being surprised by a Detroit Free Press poll that showed 42% of union households supported right to work. It caused quite a stir when that poll came out. There were polls around the time the law was adopted, but most recently, both the Mackinac Center and Progress Michigan have done polls on attitudes towards keeping the right to work law. The Mackinac Center's poll found that 60% were in favor of keeping the right to work law. And although the Progress Michigan report did not report as high of support level as ours, there still was a surprising amount of support from the in favor of the law, and that even though the rate of union households that they polled was higher than the representative sample in Michigan. So I think the public still supports keeping the right to work law on balance, but of course it's not universal.
I've not looked at studies or polls specifically on the issue, except exactly what you said, and that the Democrats were incredibly clear about their priorities. I mean, I think it was talked about, this is number one priority, and we saw what happened in the November elections. So rather than looking at polling data, I would look at who did people vote for in November in terms of who they wanted to represent them in passing labor laws in this state. And that's pretty indicative of where the state lies. And that's in alignment with what a lot we've seen, in that unions are having a moment. The popularity of unions, the support for unions is much higher than it's been in 50 years, but higher than it was in 2012 for sure. And I think that's one of the reasons we saw the flip of the legislature. I
just wanted to point out that they did make it clear in a broad sense, but few campaigned on repealing right to work. Maybe Kofia up in Traverse City here mentioned it. She's very much in favor of repealing the right to work law and opposed its creation originally. But I think that being swept into the power had a lot to do with national politics and a particular ballot initiative that people came out to vote on in the last election, and not a dramatic reform of labor laws.
I'm going to ask a sort of a wrap-up question here and maybe give each panelist an opportunity to respond. What does your organization think about repeal of right to work? Do you support it? Do you not support it? And why? Supporting
right to work, making Michigan a right to work state, and defending right to work has been a priority for, well over a decade for the Grand Rapids Chamber. And as I mentioned, it's not about being anti-union. It's about creating that choice and signaling that Michigan's open for business. We think it's vital to having a robust business climate here. And compete nationally and globally for jobs. Talk to people in the automotive sector. A lot of these automotive projects are partnerships, right? It's not just one company. And their partners are looking for states where, where right to work is a part of the regulatory structure. So we're going to be part of the coalition defending it. And we know this debate's coming again in Michigan, and we're going to be partnering with business groups around the state and employers to make the case for keeping right to work. Sweeping changes like this going in this other direction, we think would be bad for business and send the wrong signal.
Well, I'm going to shock everyone and say that I'm in fact in favor of the repeal of right to work, as are all of my clients that are labor organizations. Unions promote higher wages. Unions statistically enable higher wages, better working conditions, improved life for the middle class. They are good, and right to work chips away at the ability for them to do those good things, to improve the lives of all of us, of the people that live in this community. And you talk about choice, and people absolutely have choice. That's why Janus is different for public sector than for private sector. You have no right to a private sector job in terms of you can choose it. You can choose to go work in an organized environment. And when you choose to go work in an organized environment and to reap the benefits of that organized environment, you can contribute for those benefits. You can share in that. That is the collective. If you want to vote to no longer be an organized environment, you may do that as well. I think in today's climate, looking at it from the employer's perspective, I can argue it all day from the employees. From the employer's perspective, be the state that says we support organized labor to improve wages across the board, to improve safety across the board, to promote equity, equality across the board. Be that in this time when employers are looking to improve retention and recruitment, recruit in that way for your labor market. I think across the board, letting unions do what they are very good at works well, and people have the choice. They can work where they want to work, and they can vote for unions or not vote for unions when they have all of the benefits that they get from a collective bargaining agreement in terms of higher wages and higher benefits, better safety standards, better paid leave, just cause employment. They can then contribute to those benefits.
From 20 to 21 alone, 860,000 plus Americans on net balance have chosen to move to right to work states. They may not be saying to themselves, oh, I love to go to Texas because it's a right to work state. But the right to work state signals that the state is open for business more so than a state that lacks a right to work law. And it's the untold story of American migration for the last 60 or 70 years now. Scholars isolate that impact, the influences of interstate migration, and they point to right to work continuously as one of those driving tools, as Andy has mentioned, but it's just one of them. We think it is one of the best economic development tools that Michigan has to offer, and certainly far superior to handing out hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies to particular corporations in the hope that they'll cross over into Michigan's border, expand here, or join Michigan, or have an existing company that expands here, or just tries to retain jobs with subsidies from taxpayers. That's the irony here. We're on the cusp of switching economic development programs, and not in a good way. Lawmakers are trying to goose up corporate subsidies while considering repealing right to work. That's wrong for Michigan, and it could result in another lost decade of economic and population growth.
Nate, I'm not going to ask you that question. I'm going to shift to something much more. If you want to answer it, you can. But Miller Johnson, we have clients, and we take on client positions. So in many cases, they don't all see eye to eye, and we're their representatives. Why don't you talk a little bit, Nate, about what it means to the unionized employer and the non-union employer if it gets repealed? What does that mean?
Well, if you're a unionized employer and it gets repealed, then the question is what your collective bargaining agreement says right now. So 10 years ago, when this train was coming down the tracks, there were a lot of pretty concerted efforts on organized labor side, for understandable reasons, to include language in the collective bargaining agreement that said, okay, we understand that Michigan is now a right to work state, and obviously have to abide by that. But in the event, at any time in the future, that right to work is repealed, then whatever union security clause that we previously had in this agreement in its entirety is just going to reappear. It's going to be considered to be back in full force and effect as of whatever the effective date of the repeal is. And so if your contract as a unionized employer has something like that in it, then union security will sort of magically reappear, and it will have the same force and effect that it did before all of this happened. If your contract doesn't have any language like that in effect, and some contracts don't, in some contracts, the union security clause was simply removed because it was no longer lawful, then at your next negotiating opportunity, the union will presumably want to reinstate it, but that will be a subject of bargaining. If you're a non-union employer, this doesn't mean anything to you legally, may mean something to you for all of the reasons that we've discussed today. Doesn't mean anything to you legally until or unless you have organizing activity.
I just wanted to say thank you again to our awesome panelists. I think this was very helpful. I think the listeners and viewers are going to enjoy the content, the ideas, the thoughts, the varying perspectives. This is an important public policy issue that's going to be debated in our state in the next few months. And I think this has been very helpful. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.